Okay, so today's presentation is called The Ones That Got Away. And what I'm going to be talking to you all about is sort of what we do and don't know about what is successful in our colleges, and some surprising new research that's come out that's helping us understand that there are more ways to be successful than to complete a community college degree or certificate. So one thing I'm going to apologize for is it looks like a lot of the builds in this presentation got distorted when I uploaded it to Confer, so some of the spacing may be weird on these slides, but I think we can still cover the content. All right, so to get started, I actually think it's really important to tell you a story, because when I started working on better tracking workforce training outcomes, what I kept hearing from CTE practitioners was that somebody needed to help them do a better job of telling their story, and sometimes these stories can say as much as the data themselves. So I call this the tale of two auto tech programs. So once upon a time, there was a college that had an auto technology program, and they were trying to decide as part of the program review process if this program was doing well. So the first thing they did is they went in and they looked at the completion rates for the program. And what they saw is that the numbers had never been particularly high, and they appeared to be going down. So then, being really long-sighted college professionals, they wanted to look at wage gain. They wanted to see what happened after the student left the college. And what they saw is that there wasn't a really big boost in the earnings that those students were attaining after they left. So then they started looking at their enrollments, and they saw that this was really going down. And so clearly something was going wrong. And especially when they looked at the cost of the programs, they saw this was a very expensive program, because you have to maintain an actual automotive bay with cars that people work on, because it's a hands-on program. And so when the college looked at the program this way, it didn't look like a very good bet. But it could be that we could tell the story in a very different way. So if you were to dig deeper and look at this program, you would discover it's not actually a single program, but it's 4 different programs all sort of rolled into one. So the first component is a conventional certificate program. So it's a cohort model. They're working mostly with people that have come out of high school. And this program works really well when you look at its outcomes. So it's got a really strong completion rate. You can see that the students are making a living wage. If they've had before wages from before, if they weren't coming straight out of high school, you see an improvement in the wage gain. And the enrollments in this program have remained really steady. Even through the Great Recession, they had a lot of people that wanted to be in it. So that part of the program is doing really well. So there's a second component of this auto tech program, and it's an apprenticeship program. So this was something that was built with the local unions, and the intention was to help get people into that learn and earn scenario where they could get right into the workforce and really learn on the job as well as being in college. Well, the problem is the union had been broken in this region, and the program was just disintegrating because there were no jobs left to put people in. So this helped account for why the enrollments are really going down in this program. And because a lot of the students don't finish because they're in this integrated sort of work and learning environment, there wasn't any tracking that was being done in things like Wage Tracker that looks at graduates. And so they only had anecdotal evidence of what happened to these students afterwards. So there was a third component to the program, which has some commonality with the apprenticeship program, but it's different. And it's really a skills update program. So one of the things that the faculty had noticed is you could train people in that first conventional certificate program on all the fundamentals of auto repair. But then when people actually went out on the job, I mean, there are thousands of different types of cars on the road. And so often people would need to come back to sort of understand better how you handle the complexities of all the different types of cars. And also cars keep changing. So people had to come back and retake things like the transmissions course, because how you run a car now is largely driven by a computer, and that technology changes pretty rapidly. So what they would do is they would encourage students to come back and retake courses, because it helps cement their learning or get them up to date. So these students weren't ever even trying to complete. So the completion numbers were abysmal for this, because all they wanted was that course or two that they needed. And they didn't have any wage gain because they were keeping their jobs. They were just maintaining the skills they needed to stay employed. And the other thing that was sort of surprising about this program, this part of the program, is that it also was dying. And the reason that it was dying was because of the new repeatability regulations. So these students were being told that they could not come back and retake the transmissions course. And the faculty had done this heroic effort one year where they went back and they created a new course and they ran it all through the curriculum committee, and it just about killed them because it took so much work. And the faculty just said they couldn't do it anymore. So they were telling students that you only had a one shot at the community college. You could take the course once, and after that it was up to you to figure out how to stay up to date on things like transmissions. So that is the third component of the program. And then the final component of the program is actually a community education program. So they had a couple of courses that they would offer that were really intended just, to help people understand their cars better. So for example, they had a course that was specifically for women about how to understand how your car runs so that you can do a better job fixing yourself or knowing how to negotiate when you go to a repair shop. So this program also didn't have any completions because people would just take the one course. And you don't really have any wage gain because this isn't about people's jobs. Maybe they'll have a little bit more money because they wouldn't pay so much for a car repair, but that's not going to show up in the unemployment insurance wage database. So here again, it's another part of the program that is going to show poorly in the standard success metrics that we've got. So if you look at the program this way, you've got a very different understanding of how successful it is than if you looked at the whole thing together. So the reason I'm telling you this story is to point out some problems that we've got with our current conversation about what student success means. And it shows up really acutely in career and technical education, but it probably shows up in some other areas as well. And this is what it really boils down to. We have this vision in our minds of what it means to go to college. And this picture of the person with their sheepskin, or you can imagine someone throwing their hat in the air, really is sort of what we all default to when we think about what college means. And embedded in that understanding are a couple of key attributes. So the first is that when you go to college, you're going to take a lot of courses. And you're going to take those courses over a period of a couple of different years. And then when you finish it, you're going to get some kind of credential. You're going to get that sheepskin that's in the picture. And once you have it, it's good for life. I mean, none of us had to go back and redo our bachelor's degrees because once you have it, that's sort of the gold star that says that we all have some skills that we're always going to have. And then the assumption is that once you have that gold star or those letters after your name, that's what opens the door to employment. So that's all you need to go out into the world and be able to at least have a living wage. But unfortunately, that doesn't really match with what's going on in the workforce today. So right now, the world of work is evolving really, really quickly and in ways that are moving us away from that old assumption that all you needed was a degree and you were all set. And there's a couple of reasons why things are changing so rapidly. So the first is has to do with technology. So here I was giving you an example of an auto tech program, which most of us think of as very blue collar. But in fact, computer technology has integrated every field that you can imagine. And we all know that the pace of change for technology, even trying to keep up on the version of Microsoft Word, takes a lot of effort. And so there is a need for retraining of people that have already received credentials in the past to keep up to date with all the changes that are happening in technology. So it's transmissions for automotive, in machining, a lot of that's done with computers now. It even affects those of us that have sort of professional jobs because there's ways that we're expected to be proficient with technology. So that's requiring people to go back and get more training. The second thing that's really changing the world of work is that we've got this profound shift in what employment is like in the United States. So you have people that went to school potentially and were trained to do a job. And now those jobs don't exist anymore. They've been outsourced, they've been automated, they're gone. And the job options that are available to them, if you want to get past that low-level service sector jobs, are often things that didn't exist when those students did their original training or those workers did their original training. So you've got people that have skills, but they're out of sync with what's needed in the workforce. So they need to go back and fill in those gaps because some things apply, but not everything does. But there's more to it just than what's changing about the structure of employment. There's also a fundamental change in what employers expect of their workers. So what we've seen is that employers have basically eliminated their professional development programs for workers. And what we're hearing a lot in the rhetoric about the skills gap right now is that employers are so frustrated because they put out a job posting and the people who apply are not acceptable to them. Because what employers want is somebody who can walk in that door on day one and go into that cubicle or into the bay where they're going to be doing their working, and they're expected to just pick up the tools and go. And so really the onus of preparation has fallen on the individual. It's up to the job seeker to have exactly the suite of skills that an employer wants before they're even going to make it to the interview list to potentially get that job. So that means that people also have to go back to fill in these gaps that are idiosyncratic to particular professions or companies. And the final thing that's really beginning to affect our standards understanding of what college is for and what it gives you is that there are a lot of sectors who've gotten frustrated with academic credentials, and they don't feel that they are specific enough for those, again, highly localized skills that employers are looking for. So what you see is across the board, many industries have gone out and developed their own certification programs. So like the Cisco certification is a really easy one to think about. But it's in all different sectors. So there's one in metalworking. I mean, there's one in OSHA for safety issues, which is very important if you're going to do petroleum technology. So there are all of these credentials that are not academic credentials, which may in fact be more valuable to the employers than the academic credentials because they're skills-based. Then the employer knows it, like you do know the latest version of Cisco. So this has also created a shift. So what's interesting is that if you go and look at what colleges are doing, especially community colleges, you actually see that we've been quite responsive to this shift. And one of the ways that you can see that is in the change from how much colleges are offering degrees to how much they're offering certificates. So these next set of figures are coming from some research that was done by Georgetown University. And what they're showing is that back in 1980, only 8% of the post-secondary awards in this country were from certificates. But now we're up to more than 1 in 5. So when you start talking to about what it is that Americans get when they go into post-secondary, increasingly it's not a degree. It's actually now certificates are the second most common award. So it's more likely that someone has a certificate than that they have an associate degree. And more than half of these certificates are short-term, meaning that they can be earned in a year or less. So you can see how this is starting to shake that assumption about what college is. It's not necessarily so many courses. It's not necessarily over so many years, because increasingly it's short-term. When you look at California, this trend is actually even more pronounced. So there was a study that I helped put out a couple of years ago where it said that 2/3 of the community college programs lead to certificates and specifically to short-term certificates. And many of these aren't even reported into the chancellor's office. So when we're looking at completion rates, they're probably understated because colleges aren't reporting credentials that are less than 18 units, even though it's largely what they offer. So we've got this big disconnect in even understanding the success of what we are offering. So really the crux of the problem is that you have community colleges that have gone out, they've been responsive to the workforce, they've understood that there's all these reasons why you need to offer short-term, often modularized training to help people prepare and stay current in order to be able to get employed. So we've been doing it right, and yet all of our definitions of what college is for and what it's supposed to result in don't match that. So a lot of these students that are successful, that are completing a short-term certificate program that a college is offering, are being counted as failures in our statewide accountability frameworks, which really distorts the importance of the role that community colleges play in keeping a vibrant and feasible workforce and in helping people get and stay out of poverty so they can give their families a reasonable floor from which to live. So we really need to start talking about the fact that there are multiple pathways that run through our institutions, just like those 4 examples that I gave you of what happened in that auto tech program. So now that you know the context, the bigger picture of what we're trying to look at, it's really interesting to look at a couple of different studies that have come out recently that are trying to understand the question of the different pathways that exist through community colleges in workforce training and what the employment and wage gain outcomes of those different pathways are. So I'm going to be talking to you about 3 different suites of studies. So one set was done by Peter Barr, who used to work at the Chancellor's Office. He's now at the University of Michigan. Another suite was done by Ryan Fuller, who works at the Chancellor's Office. And the third was done by Casey Graney, who is the one who now runs the CTE Outcomes Survey. So each of these studies is different and has a different number of students engaged and sometimes slightly different time frames. But to take it together, they actually are remarkably consistent on a lot of fronts. So this is something that you can go and look at more later if we want to talk about the specifics of the methodology. But Barr's studies are very large, where he's looking at hundreds of thousands, or in one case 750,000 students that were in community colleges. Peter Barr's research tends to focus on first-time students. Then what Ryan Fuller was doing was taking slightly smaller groups of students and looking at things like what they said their college goal was, as well as looking at comparisons for earnings for completers and non-completers. And then Casey Graney is working with the outcome survey respondents. So we're getting about 11,500 students that either had an award or had left after taking 9 or more units. So one of the things that's so exciting about the research done that we present is that each of these studies came at the problem in a slightly different way. So Peter Barr really wanted to start with course taking and then look at wage earnings. Ryan Fuller was looking at intention, their goal, and also just completion status. And Casey was looking at this broader picture of all the employment outcomes. And so the fact that the data that I'm about to show you are really overlap considerably makes us feel pretty confident that what we're seeing in the data are real, they're reliable. So let me talk you through some of the findings. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be hopping between the studies, because it's really when you put them together that you get a more coherent picture. So you can always look down on the right-hand side of the screen and you'll see whose study and which study it was. So the first thing that I think is really important to share is that when Peter Barr goes in and he looks at this issue of the returns to the credential. How much more do people make after earning some sort of award at a community college? What we get is really good news. And this list is not just for workforce training. This is for everything. And this is really important to be looking at, because there was a study that just came out that Mina Dadgar, who works at Career Ladders Project, just put out based on the university, of data from the state of Washington. And her study found that low unit certificates do not yield a wage gain. And I think what's really important to look at from this data chart is that that is not true in California. So here we can see that the associate's degree nets people a 7% increase in earnings. The long-term certificates are the most valuable, where you're getting a 17% boost. But here you got both short-term certificates and these really, really low credit awards. And you're seeing gains that are bigger than the associate's degree return. So I think that this is a wonderful thing to celebrate, that we are able to offer a diversity of credentials that are really making a difference in the lives of students. But what we're discovering as we really look at wage outcomes is that looking just by the kind of credential that you receive is not as helpful as if you start to break it down and see what it is that the students are studying that led to that wage gain. So this is probably the scariest slide to present, because what it shows is how much wages increased for workforce-related programs versus non-workforce-related programs. And what these charts are showing you on the left here, there are 18 broad fields of study, and Peter was working out of the top codes. And of those 18, 13 of them ended up with students making significantly more money, having some sort of wage gain after they were at the college. What you're seeing on the right-hand side is that of the 10 broad fields of study that are not workforce related, none of those programs of study yielded any wage gain for the students that completed those credentials. So one of the things that's really tricky when you start talking about earnings related to the value of an education is that this slide could be misinterpreted, in which it says there's a big fat zero. There is no value in studying something that's not workforce related. And I don't think that that's the takeaway from this slide. I think what it shows you is that the training that we provide in non-workforce related programs that terminate in an Associates of Arts degree don't have value on their own. And so they're going to have to be added onto in order for students to get wage gains, whether that means that they really have to transfer and keep going, which is why the transfer associate's degree is probably going to be really helpful for a lot of our students, or they may have to get additional credentials that may be more specialized. But what is important is that we're seeing that the bulk of the earnings gains, actually all of the earnings gains that come out for community colleges are coming from the workforce side of the house. So if things go forward with the feds putting out a scorecard that evaluates colleges based on how much students make afterwards, or when you've got this issue of gainful employment where you have to prove that students are making more than the poverty level and that they're not overly burdened by their debt, if you see a positive number associated with California community colleges, it's coming from the workforce side of the house. But even that doesn't really give you a clear enough picture, because if you dig a little bit deeper, what you start learning is that the value of various credentials is different depending on what it is you study. So I've got two different types of programs here. On the left we've got the engineering and industrial technologies, and on the right we've got public and protective services. So what you can see is that in engineering, the low credit certificate doesn't buy you really much of anything, but the short, long-term certificates or associate's degrees are all equally valuable. So if a student's trying to make a decision, that they might be able to go multiple ways. But if you're over at public and protective services, you can see the bulk of the value is in the certificate programs, specifically the short-term certificates. And if you start talking to faculty about why does it look like this, they can immediately explain to you why. So for example, the reason you see that big bump in the public and protective services is that a lot of colleges coordinate with entities like POST, which is the training program for police officers. And that they come back and they do very short-term certificates that are associated with what they need to do to keep current to continue to be a peace officer. And that's where you're seeing that gain. It allows them to climb a salary scale. So as we're trying to understand the value of credentials and the value of college, you're getting a lot more information when you're all the way down here at the program level. So all this has been looking at outcomes for students that actually complete a credential that gets offered by a community college. But Peter Barr went further on this, and he wanted to understand what happens if you don't earn a community college credential, because there's so many stories out there from CPE practitioners about their successful students who go on and get a job and they leave the program and they never complete. And many of you have probably heard me present particularly this slide before, because this study is about a year old. And so what Peter found is that within many of the 16 out of the 24 more specific workforce subfields, he was seeing significant earnings gains after taking only a couple of courses. So what you see on the slide here is a list of different types of programs, and then you see their increase in earnings at 6, 9, and 12 credits. So there's a couple of things that are important in this graphic. The first is some school is good, more school is better. So we're seeing that there is a return on investment, that there is something that the students are learning in these courses that is making a difference in their earnings. And we're also seeing that it's not always the same. That water and wastewater technology is having these huge jumps at 12 or fewer credits, whereas if you're down in computer infrastructure, it's smaller. But we can still understand that there is some value that's going on in this non-completion course taking, that currently these students are being counted as failures. One of the reasons that this is so important to understand is to go back to Mina Dadgar's study about the fact that there was no value in low unit certificates. So if you look at how she did that study, what they did is they compared the certificate completers with all of the non-completers. And if you look at her data, you see that the non-completers have wage gains. And what it is that the completers and the non-completers have virtually the same earnings gains. And one of the reasons that may be happening is for things just like what's on this slide, that students are able to master the competencies and the skills that are taught in those courses and translate it into some value in the workforce, and the completion of the credential isn't that important to their ability to get that value. So it's really important that we're able to demonstrate things like these earnings gains for skills builder students. All right, so now I'm going to pivot a little bit from Peter Barr's research and talk a little bit about Ryan Fuller's research. So he was really trying to understand, was it important, if you said that you were there to update job skills, like did it work? because people that are updating job skills when they've listed as their goal, are not saying that they're there for an associate's degree. And so when he looked across all program areas, he saw that indeed there was an 11% boost in the earnings of people that said they came to community colleges to update a job skill. So here we're seeing another place that we're being successful that's currently being counted as a failure. So we can see that actually we help them achieve their goals, which is really good news for us to be sharing. But one of the other things that came out of Ryan's work that became really important in understanding what's going on with these wage gains for non-completers is that he was looking at both first-time students and returning students, whereas Peter Barr's research had all been on first-time students. And what became really apparent when you started looking at Ryan Fuller's research is that there's a really clear demographic for who these students are. And when he was looking at relative earnings gains for completers and non-completers by various characteristics like students' age or what they studied or what their goal was, what you see is that the non-completers are doing better than the completers in a couple of different categories. So if you're 35 and older, non-completers always make less than completers. If you're 25 and older and you're only taking a couple of units, non-completion is a better route for you to go, particularly in a couple of fields like real estate and auto tech, electronics, and administration of justice, which again, if you go back to the colleges, makes sense because this is where there's a lot of those little skills upgrade courses that have been very carefully constructed and well calibrated with the needs of the field. And then you also see the same results when people say that they're there to either for personal development or updating their job skills. So we can see that this is an intentional course taking that is being done by older people. And one of the reasons why it's so important to understand this is that I would never want people to walk away from this research and say, oh, all you ever have to do is take 1 or 2 courses. You can just take those 6 units and you're going to be fine. Because that's not universally true. If you start looking at the earnings gains based by age, you see that for young students, that is not true. Short-term course taking is not a good option for younger students. And the reason is a common sense one. If you're coming straight out of high school, you don't have a lot of skills. And so the couple of courses will give you a little basic knowledge, but probably not enough to get a living wage job. Whereas if you've been out in the workforce and maybe you have other credentials and you go back and you do a little bit of training, it adds on to your skill sets. It's that process of reskilling that's being required in the modern job economy that helps account for that. So here's some examples that Ryan did that shows this, where you see that completers, the green bar, is higher for the 20 to 24-year-olds. And it's really in this middle area where you've got people who probably have some job or life skills that they are layering on with what they are learning in college that yields the wage gain, especially when they're doing really low unit course taking. However, when looking at this, it's really important not to walk away with the assumption that, oh, it would be better if if people just didn't complete. But if non-completion is better, then let's stop completion. Well, that's not actually true either. And this is most obvious when you look at Casey Graney's research, because she actually, in parsing the data from the CTE Outcomes Survey, she actually looked at this question of both what you made in real dollars and also how much it changed. And so what you see here is that the non-completers are coming in at a higher earnings threshold before they start taking courses, and they end up with a higher earning threshold afterwards. But the percentage change is smaller. So the completers, who tend to be younger, probably don't have the full set of skills, see a bigger increase in how much money they're making by taking that full set of courses and getting the credential, whereas the folks that are just there to upgrade job skills, they were already higher. And that's just really important in understanding the relative value and, again, who it is that is benefiting from this kind of course taking. So what was very helpful is after we started seeing these patterns based on age, is that all 3 studies went and took a look at the average ages for their non-completers. And what you see here is that the number is remarkably consistent. It's 37 or 38 years old. And then the other thing that was helpful out of both Fuller and Graney's research, because they were looking at returning students, they were able to see that a lot of these students already had some sort of credential. So Fuller finds that a third of those students had gone to a four-year college before enrolling, and Casey found that just over a quarter also had some sort of higher degree. One of the things that Fuller found in his research was that often these students had been at if they had a credential, it had come from a community college before. So they were our repeat customers that we were helping to keep current. So we're beginning to again understand that the skills building course taking that yields wage gain is happening in the context of building additional skills to stay employable. So then the last thing that I want to show you in here is something that Peter Barr then did, because he was just very, very curious about this question of is there value in the courses, and what is it that confers the value? So what he wanted to understand is how much does it matter if you actually complete? And he did that by comparing the outcomes of people that had taken the same number of courses, and the only difference between them was whether they had gotten the award or not. So what you're seeing in this chart, everywhere that there's red letters, what it's saying is that completing that credential didn't matter. It didn't affect how much you earn. Whereas if you're seeing green numbers in there, what you're seeing is that earning that credential made a difference. So what we can see from this is that in health, it's always important to complete, that there is a significant increase in how much you are going to earn if you go ahead and you complete that credential. But if you look down at information technology, nobody cares if you finish the community college credential. All they care is that you know how to fix whatever's wrong with the machine or write the code. So what we're seeing in here is that the signaling power of credentials really varies depending on the field. And so what we've got is a variable story about what it is that would enable you to adequately understand the success of a program. So in health, looking at completion would be a really good idea. In information technology, maybe not so much. And in a lot of these others, it really varies depending on the length of the program, which probably has to do with the purpose that it's serving within the college. So if you go back to the original story I told you, the difference between the upgrade skills pathway versus the apprenticeship versus the cohort program versus the community education program. All right, so one of the things that as you really start to dig in and you look at what these programs are that are showing the wage gains, is that you begin to notice that they are often aligned with some sort of third-party credential, and often intentionally by the college itself. And this also is borne out by the research. So in the outcome survey, 41% of those non-completers said that they had earned some sort of third-party credential. And also the Census Bureau did a study where they were trying to understand how important a third-party credential was for increasing earnings. And what they found is that it does increase earnings across the board, but particularly those who report that they have some college and those who say they have an associate's degree. Now, one of the things that's really, really important to understand about that some college designation is that this is where the results of a lot of our programs lie. Because if you earned a community college certificate but not an associate's degree, then you're categorized as having some college. So much like the example I gave from Mina Dadgar's study where you ended up with completers being compared against non-completers that included people that had gotten wage gain as a result of what they learned in the courses, we've got this problem in which there's a bucket in which all the students that are earning credentials, or sorry, certificates, which as we showed earlier are an increasing number of the people with post-secondary awards in the United States. They're being lumped in with people who went to college for a little while and dropped out. So we don't have a very fine lens with which to understand the value of all of the certificates that we've been developing over the last 30 years that are making a difference in earnings, that account for the bulk of the earnings gains experienced by California community college students. So it's becoming very important for us to try to find a way to get that third-party credential data to understand if what's happening is that our students are completers, but they are just external completers. They learn all the content with us, then they go get somebody else's credential that has a better signaling value in the field than what we have to offer. So what does all this mean? I think it's really important to look at how this is going to affect the way we talk about success. And really what I see is that our current success metrics may be missing some of the areas where we are having the biggest impact, where we are being most successful. So we know that the bulk of the economic value from community colleges is coming out of the workforce training many of it in short-term options. So we have to go out there and advocate for why short-term certificates or short-term training opportunities may be highly valuable for some sets of students. Secondly, we need to be able to explain that although we're all pushing for completion, it's not always critical in workforce training pathways, either because the credential we offer doesn't have any value out in the field, or because we are training older students that don't need that credential because they're filling in skills. And the final thing that we need to really focus in on, I think this is really important for the research community, is that our metrics need to be more nuanced. I mean, the great thing about the scorecard is it makes it look simple, but that's also the hardest thing about it because it obscures this level of detail. And you can't really understand what's working and not working or who it's working for unless you start to dig a little bit deeper. We could easily remove all the audit tech programs because we didn't dig deep enough to understand which parts of it are working and why, and understand are those really good reasons to eliminate that program. So there are a couple of policy implications that I see, especially coming down the pike right now when we have so many enormous change efforts that are underway. So the first thing that I think we need to take a good look at is educational planning. So what's not clear to me as we're building out these new tools is how much skills builder pathways are being built into them. So the risk is that you have educational planning in which you are pushing all students to go toward getting like an associate's degree or a transfer opportunity. And that if you're basically telling students that those are the only appropriate pathways, what does that do in our ability to understand all of these short-term course takers, all these skills builders, the incumbent worker training that many of our colleges have so carefully built? So we need to make sure that we are tracking these students in things like our educational planning systems, and we're not putting burdensome requirements on them. That student, if they want to come take a quarter credit handgun safety class, does not have to complete a long-term educational plan in order to be able to enroll. The second and related issue has to do with assessment. So now we have this new mandate about how all students should be assessed to see if they need basic skills to get enrollment priority. But the question is, should skills builders take those tests? If someone's coming for that quarter credit handgun safety, do we really need to know what their algebra skills are? And how are we going to handle those exemptions? Like, how would we know which students shouldn't take the test? And how do we make sure we set that up in a way that we don't have students game the system so that they don't have to take the test when they should? So that's another nuance we need to look at. The third area is the issue of repeatability. And the story that I gave you in the beginning actually came from a real college. As I talk to CTE practitioners from around the state, the new rules about repeatability are really having an extremely negative effect on a lot of the workforce training programs because there is a system by which faculty had set things up so that students would come back and retake courses to help either update skills or to finish learning something that doesn't fit nicely into our credit timelines of what we think when a class should start or end. So I think it's going to be very important that we figure out ways to make it more possible for students to come back and redo that training, or else we have to be crystal clear that we only provide training to people one time, and that once they've had that training, they're out. The problem with that is that if we don't provide it, the only other option basically are the for-profits or the privates, and those are much, much more expensive. So there's a real equity implication to us deciding that we're not going to engage in incumbent worker training that requires people to come back. And the final one is just this question of completion, and how can we have skills builders fit into tools like the scorecard, or if we're setting system-wide goals and increasing completion numbers, how do we make those things fit together? Do we start issuing credentials where we can see that there's economic value for small clusters of course taking, or do we amend the scorecard so there's a skills builder metric that's based on wage gain, which actually was proposed but was not accepted this October, so that there's just a number of places like this where there's really important policy implications. That said, I think there's a lot of opportunities that we have. So California is just incredibly lucky that we've been able to do this kind of research because so much of the workforce training happens in the for-credit side of the house, just as an accident of the way California set things up for its funding. So we've been able to go in and find all the Skills Builder students and hook it up with the unemployment insurance wage database and figure out how much better they're doing. And one of the really interesting things that happened when the scorecard committee decided not to put a Skills Builder CPE metric on, it wasn't because they didn't think it was important. They just wanted to make sure that the colleges would feel comfortable with what was being proposed. So right now, up in the Chancellor's office, Alice Van Omeren and Ryan Fuller are working on developing a set of data tables that would go out to every college in the state that would tell you where you had earnings gains for skills builders and in which programs, so that you would understand what your numbers would look like in the scorecard, and also, more importantly, you would finally have access to some information about where it was working. And then you could have some fascinating conversations with those programs or those faculty members to understand what it is that's going on. And what you may learn is that it's a very small unit program that's aligned with a third-party credential. You may find that there are completers in this program. It's just that none of that data is getting reported up to the Chancellor's office. We think that's happening a lot in early childhood education. So there'll be this wonderful opportunity afforded to all of you to dig into this data without having to go do the research yourself. And I think that is going to make a tremendous difference for being able to move this forward. So you've got those data that will be coming to you in the near future. And then in addition to it, there's a couple of resources that if you want to start this conversation on your own campus, that you can access. So this is a very complex topic. Here I am barely fitting it into 45 minutes. But I have created two videos. There's a 4-minute video and an 8-minute video. And what they basically do is they explain the skeleton of a lot of the concepts that I put out for you today. So the short one basically says you got to go beyond completion. And the 8-minute one gets a little bit more nuanced and explains why, because there's these different pathways with different types of students and different types of wage gains. So those videos are available up on the Chancellor's Office Doing What Matters website. And in addition to the videos themselves, there are discussion guides that are tailored to particular audiences. So there's one for policymakers, one for faculty, and one for deans, and one for college leadership. So that you could show that video and then have a discussion guide that you could use to help inform a conversation about what this means at your college. And then in addition to that, I've done a brief that's it's written in plain language, so it could be shared with sort of anyone at your college, that summarizes all the research that I just shared with you today and raises some of these policy implications, like about repeatability and some of the ways that people might want to think a little bit differently about completion and success. So I think I just hit my 45 minutes. That was a lot of information for me to sort of pour onto all of you over a telephone line. But I would love to hear what your questions are or your reactions to it, because I'm sure you've probably stumbled into bits of this as you've done your own data or have supported program review in your workforce training programs.
Okay, well, I just unmuted you so everyone, if they speak, they can be heard. But did you say that those the discussion guides are available at the same doingwhatmatters.ccco.edu?
Yeah, so the discussion guides that go with the videos, they're paired. If you follow that link that's up there, you'll see the video and right after them the discussion guides. The brief is actually both posted on the WestEd website, and I have a page there you can see. If you just go to wested.org and then just type Skills Builders into the search function, you'll get to this resource. And I've got basically one page that's dedicated to all of the different research, and it'll give you links that go out to all these different places. So it's probably a good sort of one-stop place to go. Also up on there, I did a very similar version to this webinar that I just did now, only it was a little bit longer. And that's recorded and also available from the WestEd website if you want to do a longer sharing of this content.
Great. Does anyone have any questions? Hey, Kathy, this is Kathy Hassan.
Hi.
Hi. So I'm curious. I sat in on your session where you covered the same information during the Student Success Conference in October, and we're going to do the same thing today. We're going to, once we hang up, we're going to have a little bit of a conversation around what type of research we could be doing to address some of the actually the unknowns at this point with our skill builders, because I don't think any of us are doing any particular research or providing any information on that group or population. So I'm curious to know how pervasive is this conversation throughout the state at this point, because we're part of a larger research or regional CTE group that's looking at the launch board and providing those few milestones that aren't available through MIS. We're having conversations around that, but nobody's talking about skill builders. And so I'm just wondering how much of a conversation statewide is going on around this that you're aware of.
So I think what's happened, Peter Barr first found the skills builders in the research about 3 years ago. And he and I put a brief out together at that point where we introduced the term skills builders, because one of the things that we realized is that although CTE practitioners have been talking about these students forever, there wasn't a single way they were known. So one of the things we thought would be helpful would be to give them a name. Since then, I feel like the skills builder conversation has blossomed in some places, but not all places. And I'm often surprised where I sort of bump into the term and the concept. So for example, I was at the CIO's conference last spring, and our chancellor, Bryce Harris, gets up and he does this whole presentation about the benchmarking that the chancellor's office is going to be doing and the scorecard and all these metrics. And the first question up from a CIO was, what about the skills builders? How are you mapping that success? Which floored me. I had no idea that the CIOs were that aware of the issue. And then in the fall plenary for the Academic Senate last month, there were 2 resolutions passed about the need to track skills builder outcomes. So it's making it into faculty circles. And for any of you that have been at any RP conference for the past 2 years, I do a session like this because I think this data is so important to bring forward. So I think there's pockets of the research community that understand it, and I know Mount SAC went and did its own study to try to understand where its skills builder students were. I worked with Trans Willett a number of years ago where we tried to come up with a methodology that could maybe help colleges that wanted to do local research to find those students. What I would say is, when you're able to get this file from the Chancellor's office that shows you, these are the programs of study in which you have skills builder students, and this is the percent wage gain across those, all those students, you're going to have a really potent way to begin to have these conversations in a much more focused way than we have in the past. Before now, I feel like I sort of get out and I talk about a conceptual thing, but with the data that Alice and Ryan are pulling, people can actually have a real conversation. They can say, oh, I know what that is. That's our post-policing program. And yeah, it is all these low unit certificates. Or we had no idea why this program is yielding such strong gains at only a couple of units. Let's go out and talk to our faculty about why that is the case. So I think you're going to have an opportunity to have a much more nuanced conversation. And I think one of the things that would be really helpful for me to know is that it's VERITAC, which is the statewide committee that supports the Chancellor's Office related to CTE data and research. They are going to be trying to facilitate this information going out, and they're not quite sure the best way to disseminate it or how to engage colleges once they have it. So given how organized San Diego already is on this topic, if you have ideas about ways that you would want to use this information, it would be fabulous if you let me and Nick Kramer, who runs VERITAC, know that, and then we can sort of build maybe some resources that we go out to you that would enable those deeper conversations.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Do you know about how soon we'll be able to have access to that and what that looks like?
So
is it going to come out in the form of reports, or is it going to come out in the form of data sets? Or do you know?
I do know. I've seen the preliminary polls on it. So there's a meeting next week where we're going to be just taking a look at it, making sure we've finalized the definition. One of the things that's been tricky in trying to determine how you know who a skills builder is is we've been looking at sort of factors that you could include or not include to come up with that cohort, because often you have to look backwards to find them. And so Alice and Ryan have been pulling numbers lots of different ways to try to understand that. Peter Barr has done an incredibly extensive study where he's gone in and tested hundreds of different variables you could look at. And what we want to do is get that definition nailed down, and then we would be able to give you the summary tables that will say things like, in administration of justice you see an 18% increase in earnings for skills builders. But the Chancellor's Office is not going to hand you back the unitary data, and that's because there are so many concerns about sharing the wage data that they have from EDD. And so what you would be able to do once you had that file, and maybe you saw that there's huge gains in a program that you don't understand, or ones that you want to know more about, you can take that same definition of what defines a skills builder, and you can figure out who those students are in your own data systems and then do some more research that way.
Okay. And possibly in the spring?
Well, I think if the data sets get finalized this month, we could be conceivably giving them out in January. And it's just a matter of knowing what's the best. Nobody just wants to send an email out to the RT listserv that says, hey, anyone want to look at their skills builder data? So if you've got ideas for ways that we could plug it into the more coherent processes that you're already using to better understand workforce outcomes, we would love to provide you the data in that context.
Okay, good. Sounds great. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. This is great. We're going to continue the discussion, but we'll let you get to your next meeting. I know you have one at 1:30.
Actually, I don't, and it got canceled, and I would love to listen in if you don't mind, because part of what Peter and I are doing is sort of scoping out what our next research project will be, and if I hear what it is that you're really interested in, that can help inform the research that we'll do. Okay. Absolutely. Okay. Well, if you get bored, just hang out. It's boring to regional research meeting. I know. Kathy has been waving this skill builder flag for 3 years, Kathy. I've sat in on all your sessions. Thanks for sticking with me. I think it's an important component. So one of the things that Kathy mentioned, and I think this is interesting because she and I were just talking about this morning, there's this non-cognitive component to all of this as well. And the value that our students believe they're getting out of not just their degrees and certificates, but the courses that they take. We just started doing a postgraduate study last year. So we're surveying all of our graduate students, and several of the questions ask not only are they employed, did they get a job, how long did it take you, are you working in the field that you studied, but also their perceived value of the degree or the credential that they're, I think is an important component. Yeah. The graduates are anyone that receives any certificate? Mm-hmm. Right. Or degree. Or degree. So even the certificate of proficiency? Right. No, sorry. So certificates of achievement, yeah. But I think it's, we were talking about the non-cognitive components of, for a different purpose, but I think this is,
we were looking at some disqualification data, and also at different occasions, whenever we look at student data, and Citi does some research on first-year experience cohorts, every time there is an amount of variance that cannot be explained by our interventions, our programs, and according to the survey data that we have at Citi, it's always students' personal issues, their struggles, their financial aid problems. So the non-cognitive factors, as I hear from different conferences, different conversations happening on campus, has become the interest of research nowadays. So nice words, some efforts looking at.
Billy's helping to fill in fill out the data, information that you have.
How far did you go back when you sent out?
We went, because it was the first time we've done this, believe it or not, we went 3 years back. And actually got a really good response rate. And we typically get pretty good response rates when it has to do with alumni studies, type of studies. People are interested in their college choice. And we're going to continue to do it every year at this point. And I was thinking in terms of non-conscious, I was learn about students' perceived value, because it gives, if a student perceives they are prepared, whether or not they are, for the workforce, that's sort of an added component right there to how successful they might be in getting a job and pursuing a job, self-efficacy kind of thing. Yeah. Self-exceptional.
And actually, some of our programs target at changing their attitude, increase their outcomes, so that they are the believers that they can do something.
Right. Like the FYU, a lot of FYU programs. And programs that target at-risk students under Title V. Right.
And then with the students that you surveyed, you've already done this, or you're going to? You've already done this. So you went back 3 years, and then the next year you'll add the graduates from the current year. But are you doing any long-term where, okay, they transferred, but did they actually graduate, and then what happened? Or?
This was specifically for students graduating to determine whether or not they were employed.
So it's just employment, it's not transfer.
Yeah. Oh, our transfer. So, maybe on most table there, are any of the others of you doing kinds of studies with skill builders or?
Has there been discussion that you've heard at your colleges at all, or CCP? Well, so far, we have the student profile report and their certificate report. That's so far. Who we have in the CTE program.
I mean, I think that this stuff at college, we have, for instance, not just certificate or CTE programs, but we have over 300 programs, which is a lot, too many. And they've, and that is with discontinuing 30 programs, just recently, in the last year. And so I know that there is a lot of focus on and doing that. And I think that it would be really good information for the faculty, because a lot of the faculty, they rely on maybe advisory boards, and they're in that discipline. I used to be chair of communication, and telemedia is under communication. And, I have a love for that discipline also. So you get a little bit like this, because it's, you see all the benefits and these great things that students are producing. But at the end of it, you're not really realistically seeing that, television stations are not hiring anyone in San Diego. And so someone with an AA degree or an AS degree in media isn't marketable, really. And so, and So they'll rely a little bit on their advisory committees, and then they always have the anecdotal. But one of my students is now and so I think, and they don't have time, and they can't, they can't teach studies for students because you're separating it by discipline or by degrees or credentials.
Yeah. So it occurs to me also that if this information is incorporated into program review, where faculty are looking at the skill builders, completion, whatever that might be, indicators about that, there'll probably be tremendous interest on the part of faculty, particularly for those colleges who actually use program review the way it's supposed to. The program is continuous. I'm sure they would be interested because, like I said, a lot of your tech type programs, students are coming back to Catholic Center to get their skills upgrade or promotion or prepare for a third-party credential or whatever. So if you could have evidence of that, their programs are working.
And I believe, and I don't exactly know what's involved in this, but every 2 years the programs have to give some sort of report to our governing board of ed code. And that they're permanently viable, that, we're part of the advisory committee minutes or something. But, something like that could also go into those reports. But I don't really know what those reports look like. But that's a requirement now for the permit.
I think a big part of this, at least what's happening within our district, that those skill builders, and Kathy alluded to this in my presentation, that we just finally got the approval to include the skill builder level into our MIS for reporting, correct? So now that's coming out in the award for reports. The fewer
that's a lower certificate?
The lower certificates are not being counted.
Yeah, that's a little bit different because I think we're specifically referring to students who don't necessarily receive any type of degree.
Kathy, I think that what Peter thinks, and I think based on what we've seen, especially when Westhead went in and did some follow-up qualitative research, is that some of these are low unit certificates. So they actually are completing, but because the colleges don't report the low unit certificate up to the Chancellor's office, it looks like they never completed.
So what Daniel is referring to is we just this year started reporting for our MIS data those non-state approved mini certificates, basically, because we realized that those are being recognized in the launch board. So while we're not, you go on the State Chancellor's Data Mart, I don't know if they're there or not, are they? Yeah, they are reported. They're there, and so that was an incentive enough for us to start reporting them.
So they're not Chancellor's office, the ones that are not Chancellor's office approved.
Right.
So they're under 18 units.
Correct.
But they're tracking them, counting them, and then they're going into MIS.
You can submit them. Yeah, you're not required to report them through MIS, but if you don't, you won't see them in some of these state reports.
And the reason, so they give the example from early childhood ed because this was so striking. So like we went to a college that showed they had a lot of skills builders in early childhood education. And we talked to the head of that program, and she was like, what do you mean we don't have any completers? We have all these completers. And then it turned out that these students were getting a low unit certificate that was aligned with the state licensure requirement at 6 units. So they are appearing in the statewide data sets as skills builders, as non-completers. but they'd actually completed locally. And the issue was that the Chancellor's Office doesn't recognize that 6-unit certificate as valid.
Right.
So some of this stuff is actually like data encoding problems. So one of the goals that the Chancellor set is to increase the number of CTE certificates by this huge number. And I basically said to the Chancellor's Office, okay, the best way that you can attain that is just by counting the low unit certificates that show that there's an economic gain.
Right.
And you'll probably boost your numbers by 25% because we're actually already doing it. We just aren't counting it.
Right. I think part of the problem is twofold, and it's exactly what you just said, Kathy. I would capture the data statewide to be able to show these numbers, but the other part of it, the piece of that puzzle is the accountability part. The part where the accountability measures are pushing and driving everything, the college agenda. And until those skill builders are a part of that accountability infrastructure across the state, that is going to keep falling by the wayside. So by capturing the data properly and building it into accountability infrastructure, it looks like it's headed in that direction, but until they streamline it and it comes together, and I think we're going to have these silos and pockets of discussion.
Yeah, there's a lot to it also. Kathy, you mentioned on your last slide, the whole scheduling component of this. There's a lot that faculty and offices of instruction have to work out because if they're doing their enrollment management, they should be doing it in a way that captures the pathways to degree certificate transfer. And if you start adding on these 1 and 2 skill builder type courses, that adds a whole other layer of complexity to scheduling and course and program offerings. Yeah, it's another layer, it's another discussion altogether.
Well, like one of the problems that we're having here at Miramar is identifying way of how we define our programs, because there's been various ways. You said you have about 300 programs. That's a lot of programs.
I think it's subjects.
So
Programs. You're giving certificates or degree certificates? That's right.
We have more than anyone in the region.
Yeah.
right. So like right now, we've had 25 programs, but we're now redefining what the program is. That matches the Title V educational program that says a series of courses that lead to some type of degree certificate and so on and so forth. So that'll help align us with our outcomes and assessment program of youth benchmarking, and that's what we're doing here at the college. So, my question is with regards to the skill building. And my point is that we're modeling this after CTE because it's a very prescriptive pathway, okay, that leads to gain business employment. So my question is that this is what we're undergoing in Miramar. How many other colleges are in that mode as well? As far as having an ill-defined program, that's really not capturing student pathways to those completions. Because of the whole completion agenda that's statewide, that's fine and all, but if you have ill-defined programs...
And what do you mean? What's your definition of an ill-defined program?
Well, right now at Miramar we have 25 programs, okay? Those 25 programs, and I'm going to give you an example, and one of them is our liberal arts, okay? We have one under social behavioral science that has a slew of subject matters, whether it's ethnic studies, psychology, sociology, and they kind of fit all under this kind of catch-all term. But how do you define that when it comes to what a program is, for, I should say, for outcomes and assessment, when you're looking at a series of courses that lead to a particular degree or certificate? Because this particular program, the way it's currently defined, leads to multitudes of series of degrees and certificates. So that's one of the problems, is that we have ill-defined programs that are maybe too big, that we need to kind of break down a bit more.
So oftentimes what happens, we have an excessive number of degree or certificate programs like you award merit programs like you do, it's often because, the way Daniel's describing it, you might have a particular discipline with dozens of certificates or degrees offered under them, and it may be that there's a difference of one course.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah.
When in fact you could just combine a number of those and offer one degree and make it a much more streamlined, easier pathway.
But that has to be, that conversation is the focus.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so in GIS, they have 30 degrees in physics. So,
Yeah.
imagine how difficult that is. Oh, no, I
Yeah.
And I was on the curriculum committee for years also. And, and they have now put more, they're not very, well, there are questions that have to be answered, because they have started, we have a sustainable energy program that is, and one issues. So I was kind of thinking about some of the things ill-defined, different ill-defined things than what you were describing. So, but, yeah, there's, and what you were saying, like a one class difference between the different certificates. And we have a lot of certificates of proficiency because out of all of them, I can't remember the total number, but 4 are approved by the chancellor's office. Because you can have that with an option to have them approved by the chancellor's office. All the rest of the proficiency are not met. And then we went, which this is a good thing, our ADPs, and we have 18 so that's, and in fact, that's given us a really big boost in our number of degrees awarded last year. Over 200 more. They were almost all 80.
So it seems to me that we could be doing a lot more research than what we're doing in this area, in the area of CTE, first of all. But this particular subgroup will be, as Daniel said, it becomes part of the overall sort of framework and structure. It's going to definitely become increasingly of interest. Yeah. Yeah, as a starter.
Yeah. Because to start a conversation.
And we have a CTE regional group. I don't know what they call themselves. I think we've all attended the meetings.
Special navigators.
Yeah. That was very startling.
You said navigator. I think it's alligator. Very underground. Yeah.
I think as we start to give names, like Kathy said, one of their main goals was to give a name to this group, and we can, have a common terminology where we can refer to these people, we have the methodology, of course, and have clearly defined pathways. This will help with the conversation and have a dialogue and moving the research agenda forward for this particular.
Somehow it seems to be combined with the program we're doing after beginning with defining.
Yeah, city. We've been trying to get city to do that as well.
We have a data dashboard, and so on our program reviews, so there's about 80 disciplines that participate. Well, the whole campus participates in program review, but there's 80 academic disciplines that participate on. And so they're required to take data from that dashboard to include in the program review. And there's lots of dashboards. I don't know how many there are, like 50, maybe 50. So they don't have, they can just include 2 if they want, because it's what might be important to them. Because it might be important to them. And automotive, maybe they want to see the gender difference between opening day and the term numbers or something like that. But I was just thinking, maybe for CTE programs, some sort of survey, sort of report from that survey, they could be required to integrate it into their program review, so you can make sure that they looked at it and then do, as a department, some sort of an analysis or response, whatever.
Kathy, are you still there?
I sure am.
Okay.
Yep.
So can you talk just a little bit about the survey that Casey manages?
Sure. So this was a survey that was sort of built by practitioners from across the state, and it's based on a couple of surveys that have been done by colleges for a long time. So for example, Cabrillo College had this survey. It was called the Complete or Leaver Survey. And the idea was that there's questions that often CTE programs have, like they want to know, are students employed in their field of study? Did they get a third-party credential? Did they go from part-time to full-time employment? Things that wouldn't be available in, for example, the unemployment insurance wage data set. So the survey is basically 2 sides of a page, and there was, I think, 80 practitioners who helped decide what would be on the survey that would be most useful. And it's administered by Santa Rosa Junior College. And what you do is you have to pay the cost of administering the survey, but Santa Rosa does it at cost. So you're not getting any overhead. And the reason it was done that way was twofold. One was that a lot of colleges didn't have the bandwidth to do a survey on their own, so it created an economy of scale that would enable small research shops to have access to this kind of information, and also to have sort of bulk purchasing. So for example, the survey has 3 components. That it goes out to people first by email, and then if they don't answer, by postal mail, and if they don't answer, then they get a phone call and do a phone survey. And we could bring down the cost of the phone survey by having it have a lot of students instead of buying in bulk. So the thing that's a disadvantage is that it's pricey, because if you're interviewing lots and lots and lots of students, that just does add up. So that's been a barrier for some colleges, that they don't have sort of flexible resources that can pay for it. But what it does give you is more information than is available other places, and some colleges have found that to be really useful. There's another disadvantage to it, which is that the response rates are not as high as you would like. So depending on the college, you get response rates on average that are 28%. And one of the reasons that the response rates are low has to do with the quality of the contact information that colleges are keeping on students, especially email addresses. So it's the kind of thing where if you were going to make a decision about whether to invest in it, it would be good to take a look at how your contact information is looking and if you feel confident about it. But we found that colleges that do take care with their contact information get much higher response rates. And the survey goes out to both those who have completed a credential, as is recorded in the MIS data system, or those who completed 9 or more units and then stopped enrolling for a year and have not transferred anywhere. So that enables you to get, that's why it used to be called the Complete or Leaver Survey, so that you can get the employment outcomes of both those who continued on and those who did not. And then the survey is, you can give the Santa Rosa permission to have those data show up in the launch board. And then in addition to that, one of the things that we kept hearing was that colleges would invest in doing the survey, but then there was nobody to process the data. So we're almost done with building a tool that would be on CalPass Plus, where you can see all the results already disaggregated by program and all that, so that you as the research folks don't have to spend all the time pulling those reports. You may still get questions from your program heads or faculty about the meaning of the data, especially because the response rates when you're looking by program are relatively small. But there are a number of colleges that have used the survey results really effectively. And so there's a guide up on the Doing What Matters website, and I can send a link to it, that describes how Cabrillo College used data that came out of their survey that's the same as the survey in conjunction with the kind of data that are now available in the launch board, so that they were able to make some really important decisions about program continuation that they wouldn't have been able to make if they hadn't had access to that kind of information.
So, thank you. So it's still available. You have to sign up for it once a year. Exactly.
Yes. So if you go to santarosa.edu/CTEOS, so CTE Outcome Survey. You can find all the information. The other thing is that this was a grassroots project. Our team was very heavily involved in its development. The survey questions are up on the website. So if you have the bandwidth to do this survey locally, go for it. It's not the intention is not to have everything have to run through Santa Rosa, and there are some colleges like Shasta College that do the survey on their own because they have students call and they get a higher response rate because students respond well to other students. So that's another way that you could consider interacting with those questions. And the great thing about the questions is they're being tested with tens of thousands of students. I think we have close to 50 colleges that are now participating voluntarily in it. And so you'll know that you'll have good research questions. And then if you're asking those same questions, you can get your data uploaded into the launch board because there's all sorts of metrics in the launch board that come from the survey. And then you can begin to understand how things are going. And if you're part of regional conversations, you can be looking at the same answers to the same questions together. And part of what the practitioners really wanted was to have the information be consistent so that colleges could understand, like, oh, your program's really working. What is it that you're doing? I wish that our program had that kind of outcomes. What is it that you do? And you can only really figure that out if you're looking at equivalent data.
Great. Thank you. Okay, we are scheduled to be calling Daleen. She's going to give us some RP and statewide updates. So we're going to we'll wrap this session up. But thank you so much, Kathy, for presenting this information. I think this might continue to be some discussion at the next meeting as well. And in the meantime, when you do have any updates or information, if you could send that to me or send that to any of us here, and we can pass it on, and until you really figure out a way of disseminating the information.
Absolutely. And if you have ideas for the next phase of research, or you have an idea of what to do with those skills builder data that will be available soon, go ahead and email me. My email is kbooth@wested.org. And I'd love to sort of get our heads together and think about how to do the next phase of work, because the next phase is for colleges to engage this information. Like we've made the case for why it's important to look at, and now it's going to be what happens at the local level that will make all the difference for those students. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.